Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, Don't Texas, Maine. From unlawful purges of legal voters, from the voter rolls to the attempt by Trump supporters to run the Biden campaign bus off a highway in 2020, Texas has been at the epicenter of partisan actors trying to use violence, intimidation, and illegal acts of voter suppression to influence public policy. We are going to hear about it firsthand today. Katie Naranjo, chair of the Travis County, Texas Democratic Party, is with us today. About 6 months ago, an unknown man threw a firebomb into her office, along with a note containing a politically motivated and threatening message. Thankfully, no one was injured and the fire was quickly put out, but boy, is that scary. And boy, does it tell us something about the growing threat in modern American politics. Will Hayward from the League of Women Voters of Maine is also with us today to share whether and where we may be seeing this anti-democratic undercurrent bubble up in Maine and how we can make sure that Maine doesn't end up like Texas. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today. We will hear from our speakers and then tackle questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait, though. You can send questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you. I'll keep track of them and ask them of Katie and Will at the end. If you have any technical challenges today, you can message Will Sedlak through the chat and he will help you out. This event is being recorded and we will post the video on our website later this afternoon. You can also find recordings of all of our previous programs there. Thank you again for joining us. And Katie, I will pass it over to you to start things off.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. I've got some slides as well as a video clip to share with each of you. But I just want to start by saying I'm a very proud Texan. I was born and raised in Texas, in Deep East Texas, and I'm a healthcare worker by day. What most people don't know is that being a county party chair, even of one of the major urban counties, is a voluntary position. So I'm the CEO of 2 healthcare companies. I'm also a mom to a 23-month-old. And so that's kind of who I am. And I believe that to be a patriotic Texan, we have to be honest about what's happening in our government, and we have to be participatory in our government, especially when we see things happening that we think really harm the fabric of our state. So I'm going to share my screen, make sure you guys can see this. All right, can y'all see that?
Looks great, Katie.
Great. So I started getting involved in politics when I was 8 years old. My grandmother took me block walking as a kid and told me the way I could help my teachers and firefighters and the nurses that work for my family's business was to get involved and elect good people to office. And so I want you to know a little bit about me, because I think that there is this kind of faceless monolith in the number of people that are disenfranchised, those voters, the 23,000 people who tried to vote in our 2022 primaries and who were not able to have their ballots cast. And so it's not just 23,000 people, but actual individual lives with faces and names, and who actually were trying to cast their ballot in 2022. And so like me, many of the activists that are involved are also volunteers. We have the Dallas County Chair, Christy, who's also a volunteer, and as well as many of the precinct chairs, which I don't know if you guys have precinct chairs in Maine, but precinct chairs for the parties are essentially the neighborhood representatives that are elected officials in our primaries for each of the parties. So voting access is a unique.
Can I interrupt you for just a second? And do you want to start in the presentation mode so we can't see your desktop?
Oh, sorry. Yes. Oh, I thought
Sorry,
that.
I said it looked perfect, but
Okay, let me see what's
it could
going
be
on.
even more perfect.
There we go. Well, yes, we would like that to be the case. So it says I'm in presentation mode, but I don't know if I'm in the correct presentation mode for.
Katie, I would just try reloading the web page quickly.
Okay.
There it
There
is.
we go.
Is that better? There we go. Sorry, I was not in full screen. So do you still see any of the captions or different issues?
You're great now. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So Texas, access to elections in Texas is uniquely a Texas problem. There's some logistics that I'm going to go into, as well as the politics, but just as also a framework to evaluate my comments through is that while I know that this is a nonpartisan group that I'm speaking to, access to the right to vote has become a partisan issue. We see that not just in the United States, we see that in Ukraine, where literally democracies are trying to defend themselves against what is a dictatorship of Russia. In Texas, what we are seeing is we are constantly also fighting battle after battle, many of these issues starting in 2013, to have that access to right to vote. And it is partisan. The votes are along party lines. And in fact, the Supreme Court decisions that we have been debating in Texas and that have an impact to our nation have been on partisan lines. And so in Texas, we have just over 16 million people registered to vote. We are one state, but a unique fact about Texas is we have 254 counties, and the county clerk in Texas is responsible for executing the election. And so we have 254 elections, 254 different unique events on one day at one time, and then of course with early voting. So that means that there are many different interpretations, many different voting machines, and many different local requirements that change from county to county. And so I live in Austin, Texas. I'm in Travis County. However, a portion of Austin, Texas goes into Williamson County. What does that mean? It means that the Williamson County clerk who helps administer the city of Austin elections has different rules, different machines, and different requirements than the Travis County clerk administering the same election on the same day. Sounds like a mess? Can be pretty entertaining, to say the least. So it keeps us very busy. And when we talk about elections, we're not just talking about election laws themselves, although we'll be talking about that at length today. There are also many laws in Texas that impact our elections as well. For instance, open carry. In the great state of Texas, you can take a firearm into any polling location. Open carry in a polling location. Fun story, I was sitting across from my counterparts in the Republican Party while we were debating and negotiating the contracts that we have for our primaries, at which point the secretary of the Republican Party was aghast that you could take a firearm into a polling location and said that should not be allowed. We agreed, still the state law. So in addition to that, Texas, in its wisdom, the governor appoints the Secretary of State. The Senate's supposed to confirm the Secretary of State appointee unless the governor makes that appointment outside of a legislative session. So what does our governor do in his wisdom? Waits until the legislative session is over to appoint a Trump evangelist to be our Secretary of State. And then a couple of new developments that have happened just in the last 6 months. Again, reminding you that this is a volunteer effort to protect our elections, is voter databases and the requirements from SB 1. That's going to be an important thing to flag in your mind going forward. Polling locations and the placement. Early voting, when you can vote, how you can vote, where you can vote. And then another fun part is election day and the rules and regulations around that in Texas. So there's the Texas laws that impact elections. There's a Texas election law, and then there are people. And so I, as a person, have unfortunately been very much intimidated by mainly folks outside the state of Texas. Fun fact, when we talk about the Biden bus, which I won't even get into the fact that I hate that an empty bus was driving around the state of Texas that caused so much drama and stress, because that was a huge waste of everyone's time. But there were staff members and some friends of mine on that bus. I was actually there to receive the bus in Austin when the event got canceled, and can tell you that there were many calls to many law enforcement trying to get support. And no matter your political party, I believe that our public servants, as well as our first responders, should protect and support all of the citizens who participate. And so voter intimidation is real. I've had about 6 different instances where I've personally either been yelled at, had things thrown, offices with bombs, or, like I said, when I was there to receive the Biden bus, it didn't just end when they got off the highway, right? Like trying to run the staff members off the road, the folks around the bus came and surrounded us at the Texas AFL-CIO, where we then had to enforce private property laws to get the bus onto private property, at which point there were additional yelling and threats made at that time as well. And so that's just one of the instances. This is an email that I received in November of 2020, threatening to run a train on me, whatever that technically means. I've received quite a few of these, unfortunately, and this was a result of me speaking out and defending people's right to organize politically, to be at a rally, to have a peaceful and non-threatening way to participate in our government. And so not only have my folks at the Travis County Democratic Party received these types of emails threatening me, my work has received those emails. There have been calls to my offices across the state. The healthcare organization I work for is across Texas. So have my family members received messages threatening me, both on Facebook and in email and in various ways. And so it's not just the laws, but then the people and the motivations behind these laws and behind this movement to tear elections apart, and what that really gets to, right? And who are the people that it impacts? Who are the people that are being disenfranchised? And who are the people who are being intimidated to not participate? And so I just wanted to tell you my story, because while many in the Democratic world in Texas don't like it when I tell the truth about what I've experienced as a party chair, I think it's really important to call out domestic terrorism, because if you don't call it out, if you don't say what you're doing is terrorism, and the fact that we don't call it terrorism because they're white men is in fact perpetuating and even furthering their ability to continue these acts and behaviors and frankly get away with it. And so here's a quick clip on, let me see if I can do this correctly though, real quick. Here's a quick clip of when I was on Rachel Maddow recently discussing domestic terrorism as it pertains to elections. Because like I said, this is a reoccurring issue for us, unfortunately, in Texas.
This is an internal view from the internal security camera. Look at the timestamp, 2:18. Dude comes back, puts something else on fire through the broken glass that he smashed, where the fire and smoke had already started. And as you can see, this time he gets what he was looking for.
This is my office.
And curiously, we also know that the dude almost blows himself up in the process here. And we know that because of, again, the external view. Look at the timestamp. Can also tell you from that external view, thankfully, not long after, just moments later, we see a neighbor arrive from across the street with a fire extinguisher. There he is. First of all, thank you to the neighbor. But second of all, they only had those cameras because of the previous attack on their offices at the Democratic Party in Travis County, Texas. Now, we can tell you tonight that the party has been told the FBI is treating this as a credible threat. We can also tell you this attack was accompanied by a written threat to Texas Democrats. The exact content or any sort of visual of that written threat is not being released for security purposes, but we are told tonight it is an explicitly political threat. The note says, in essence, this is a warning. This will continue to happen because Democrats can keep states like New York and Texas, New York and California, but not Texas. and that note delivered?
So, like I said, and as Rachel explained, this was not our first time dealing with, sadly, dealing with an attack on our office. And thankfully, we had those cameras, and my staff was able to put them up, so we can make sure that we protect the records. Quite frankly, we keep the records for the county primaries, and in order to be able to have those for the legitimization of the election, those could have gone up in flames. And so that was the second time our office had been vandalized, and obviously the most serious time. But this is all stemming around hatred, around racism, and to be very clear, it started before this year. It's been a long drumbeat. It started in 2013, and in fact, in 2013 or in the 2012 election, what we saw in Texas is that a majority of Texas voters, well, almost a majority of the Texas voters that voted were Black and brown. And as a result, in 2013, you see our first voter ID law coming through our legislative session. For those who don't know, the Texas legislative sessions happens once every 2 years for 140 days. And what we famously say in Texas is that we wish it would happen every 140 years for 2 days. And so it's all perpetuated around this myth of voter fraud. Fun fact, there are 100 different criminal offenses in the Texas election code, mainly around voting by mail, illegally voting, and voter assistance. So if I were to go in and assist somebody with their vote by mail ballot, let's say I have clients, patients, in fact, that have MS, that cannot sign their name, that they cannot write with their hands. They're quadriplegic, total assistance needed to live their lives. If I or my staff go in and help them fill out their ballot, we could be prosecuted for voter assistance and voter fraud in the state of Texas today, even though that person of sound mind can articulate their views and what they want, we would still be prosecuted for that. And that person has a right, that disabled person who is on government assistance through the programs that we serve has a right to have their voice heard, because they probably have a perspective that elected officials haven't heard from. And that's the issue here, is representation and the perspectives and the voices of the voters that we are not hearing from. So voter ID, we in Texas, from 2002 to 2014, there were 2 cases of voter fraud that were found based on voter ID. And that's when in 2013, that's when we started our voter ID laws. Another piece is SB1 that was recently passed in 2021. If you'll remember, a bunch of Texans went to DC, we invaded Washington, DC, and we call them the Miller Dems, the Miller Ds, because they took a 12-pack of Miller Lite with them, and that was really upsetting to Republicans in Texas. Those Democrats were in DC for just over a month to fight SB1. And SB1 in particular is based on a myth, because as you'll see, currently indicted Attorney General Ken Paxton, yes, federally indicted Attorney General Ken Paxton in Texas, who is facing criminal charges himself right now, directed his office to spend 22,000 hours looking for evidence of voter fraud and of voter ID fraud. That's what SB1 is predicated on, is voter fraud. Same thing with voter ID laws, that this is a huge problem that exists. 16 cases out of almost 17 million registered voters were found, to the point where we spent taxpayer dollars, $2.2 million in taxpayer dollars to actually prosecute 3 total cases of voter fraud in the state of Texas. It's a myth. How do you register to vote in Texas? Well, the voter registration started in 1932 in Texas, but has transformed quite a bit. So we all have our voter registration cards that we receive in the mail. What is different in Texas compared to Maine is that you have to register to vote on paper. Has anyone touched paper? How about a fax machine? Does anyone know what a CD is or a floppy disk? I have interns that have never sent a fax. So to register on paper, you have to mail it in to your voter registration office, your local registration office. Because remember, there are 254 counties and 254 different elections. So I live in Travis County. I have to register to vote in Travis County. I can't just register to vote in the state. And so if I move still in the city of Austin over to Williamson County, I have to register in Williamson County and be on their list. I have to mail it to them, or I could give my voter registration application to a person called a volunteer deputy registrar, somebody who has to be certified and trained to receive your application, and then they can hand deliver it. Why is this important? Let's say when I was in college, 19 years old, registering to vote, I love a good deadline. Midnight, 30 days before an election, 11:57, I am filling out that application and getting it in. But I'll be there on time, right, in the deadline, because I'm a 19-year-old in college. Well, if you don't hand it off to a volunteer deputy registrar and they can physically hand it in, that registrar is allowed to give you a receipt as proof that you registered to vote. Why is this important? Because about 20 to 30,000 people use that deadline to register to vote, which means then our county offices have to get a bunch of temp workers to process those applications as fast as possible for then you to be able to get to vote in the election. Think that there might be errors, think that they might miss an application or two. That's why that receipt matters, because otherwise then you can't vote and you'll have to cast a provisional ballot. And so these are the ways in which 10 people here, 5 people there, 2 people there, Republicans are chipping away at people, 100% of Texas voters having the ability to access their right to vote. And why does this matter? Because in 2018, Beto O'Rourke only lost by 2%. In fact, we always like to use this stat. Beto lost by 200,000 votes in Texas in 2018 against Ted Cruz, which, can we blame him? It's Ted Cruz. 2 million people since then have registered to vote in Texas. That's why voter registration laws, additional requirements on voter registration, and limitations on voter registration have been put in place since then through SB1 in order to get at 2%. They don't need 2% in one law, but if it's voter ID, if it's ballot by mail, if it's voter intimidation suppression, that will add up to 2%. And that's not just a Democratic or Republican issue. Like, however you vote, you do you. But the reality is that the laws being passed are being passed by Republicans with the expressed intent to limit Democratic votes. And we saw that in redistricting. So this is what a voter application looks like. In fact, there's a piece right here, you'll notice it's going to be important when we talk about databases in a second, about the voter driver's license, as well as your social security number. Flag that for the future. Previously, this application, which has been in effect for, I think, probably 5-7 years now, those were optional. You could fill it out, it was not required. As a part of SB1, that is now required because the Secretary of State is now also required to have a database so again, with the 254 counties, right, 254 elections, the Secretary of State's database must report to those counties, the counties vice versa, talk to each other to confirm the number of people who were voting and that they actually exist. That was a big piece of those 23,000 people whose ballot by mail were rejected. So we have voter registration, then we have voter ID laws. In Texas, the first voter ID law was passed in 2013. The most strict voter ID law was passed in 2018, and that's what we're currently operating under. In order to cast your ballot, right, separate from registration, in order to cast your ballot, you have to have a state-issued photo ID. Now, fun fact, I testified in front of a hearing at the time, back in 2017, advocating for state-issue IDs from universities to be included. Texas has some amazing universities. Interestingly enough, the elected officials who were Republican at the time said, no, we were not going to include universities. So again, it's the consistency in which they're implementing these laws and lack of consistency and how they are particularly focused on targeting specific communities to not be able to access the right to vote. That is where we have issues, right? Because if we all want election integrity, we all want accessible elections, What does that actually mean in Texas? It definitely means, for instance, in the case of voter ID laws, being able to access all state issued photo IDs. Also, for many of these IDs, you have to pay for them. That has an additional implication as a poll tax in the state of Texas. Redistricting. We just finished our last redistricting hearing back in October to finish the maps. And what most folks don't know is in 2011, when we did redistricting previously, we had a number of Supreme Court cases and federal cases that were argued until 2019. The maps for the state of Texas from the 2010 census were not completed and not validated until 2019. That is how long the legal fight for redistricting has happened. And so similarly, we have a long tradition of cracking and packing our election districts. This is one of my favorite maps right now. There's another really famous map of Congressman Lloyd Doggett's district, which I highly recommend looking up because he went all the way from Austin to Laredo, and Texas is a big state. That was a 7-hour round trip from Austin to Laredo back, 7 hours. But what I want you to pay attention to is these green blobs. Looks like a kind of dumbbell, barbell. That's all one district. That is Congressional District 10, which goes all the way to Houston, Texas, which is roughly 2.5 hours from Austin. And so you see Congressional District 35, 37. These lines here are the actual county lines. And it goes to Creekin right here, right into downtown Austin for the sole purpose of picking up the mega mansion of Mike McCall. Fun fact, Mike McCall, as a member of Congress, has the record of using the most water during a drought in the county. Very considerate individual. So considerate that he had an entire district drawn just for him to pick up all the possible Republican voters. So in addition to voter ID, our laws around voter registration and the limits, the lack of technology of voter registration, we also have redistricting where we expressly limit the voices of individuals. And what the Supreme Court said is that you can gerrymander based on partisanship, based on party. 86% of Black women vote Democratic. 80% of Black men vote Democratic. Anyone see a trend there? Partisanship is also racial because there is one party defending the right to vote for Black and brown people. And where we see that most egregious is in the prosecution of voter violations. So it kind of all came to a head in 2021. We've had this slow drumbeat since 2013 of adding additional requirements for voter ID, changing our voter registration forms, purging voters from our voter rolls, live ones with names that try to vote that were purged. They also happen to all have Hispanic last names in that purge from the Secretary of State's office. So we now go to 2021, our most recent fight, our soon to be, next wave of litigation, SB1. What did SB1 do? Why is SB1 very important for everybody here in Maine? I mean, I'm trying to give you guys a crystal ball to see a future, right? That's what I'm here to do, is give you that crystal ball and tell you how to smash it so you can make your own future. It increased penalties for false statements on voter registration applications. It's a Class A misdemeanor. So if I put my driver's license number, because I think I've got it memorized, and I write it down on my voter registration application, I'm off by one number. That is now a Class A misdemeanor that will be prosecuted. There is also a hotline in the state of Texas where you can call the Attorney General's election integrity unit to report any suspected fraud. And in fact, there is an established requirement where, as a deputy registrar, which is a volunteer job, right? Volunteer position as a deputy registrar, I can be then criminally prosecuted if I don't report suspected voter fraud. So I don't have proof if there is voter fraud. I think there might be voter fraud. If I have the thought that there might be voter fraud as a registrar and I do not report it, then I can be reported and prosecuted. We also have this thing, poll watchers. I don't know if y'all have them in Maine, In Texas, in an election, we have our election judges that are responsible for each election location where you're casting a ballot, and you have clerks that support them. Then we also have poll watchers, people who can stand there and watch the election officials and be in the voting location, and who can validate, right? How they validate, what qualifications do they have? I don't know. They don't have to have any qualifications. Poll watchers can also open carry in a polling location. So for instance, in Texas, we have a group called the Minutemen. In particular counties where they think that any person that's brown must be illegal, they will go into a polling location. They will sign up as a poll watcher with guns, open carry, stand there and watch people vote. Does that sound fun? Does that sound inviting? Does that sound like a place where we feel safe? Many of these locations are also near schools or in churches or community centers. Poll watchers in Travis County have been, we've had at least 3 or 4 arrested for literally disturbing the peace. And thankfully, there is a provision where if a poll watcher commits a criminal act, they can be removed from the location. But there is no rule. In fact, there are specific rules saying you cannot obstruct poll watchers. So our election workers who are paid, who previously were paid $10 to $12 an hour, now thankfully we raised it to $15, at least in Travis County, but in other counties they're only paid $10 or $12 an hour, have to go into a polling location, enforce rules, help administer an election, then have poll watchers with guns in the middle of a pandemic while there's also freezes. We had to close some locations due to freezing weather. Just want to make sure everyone gets a picture of what we get to deal with. And these are individuals who we're trusting our democracy with. So, talked about databases earlier. It's not just actually the administration of the election physically in the location that you're at, but then afterwards, every night, the clerk or the election administrator uploads the list of voters who have voted. If that list of voters does not match the Secretary of State's list, those votes get pushed back. So for a couple of days in Travis County, we said 30,000 people had voted, but the Secretary of State said only 18,000 had voted. 12,000 people had a mismatch. Okay, a couple reasons why. Remember when I showed you a couple slides back, I'm going to go to it for you, where there's a driver's license and social security number. Previously, those were optional. You could do one or the other, or not at all. So I have 80-year-old, 90-year-old voters who filled out this form 30 years ago have not moved. So they have no reason to fill this out again. Those boxes did not exist 10 years ago, these ID boxes. And now those boxes, it's not required or, it's an and. So you have to put your driver's license and your social security number in order to be able to vote. Have we communicated this to voters? Have we taught folks this? Have we helped them in any way? Well, the party has, but there's actually a law expressly prohibiting government entities from proactively helping people vote by mail. That includes education and dissemination of information to help them fill out their ballot. So I have an 89-year-old precinct chair. God bless it. She has been a precinct chair longer than I have been alive. Fun fact, and she is very proud of that. I love her dearly. Precinct chair, super active in the community. Her application to vote by mail was rejected. Then her ballot to vote by mail was rejected due to lack of identification. So if the databases do not match, if the numbers do not match, or they don't have both numbers, let's say they only have one number, or they have no numbers because these laws have changed since people have registered to vote, then those get kicked back. And the election officials can tell people that their vote's been rejected, but they can only do it by mail. They have to mail them a letter. So if it's the last day of early voting and my vote's been rejected, I don't know why, I don't know how, and I get a letter 2 days after the election, I only have a certain period of time to cure that vote. Again, that's 23,000 votes that we have lost from that 2022 primary. Both Democrats and Republicans, by the way. Both parties have votes that are not being counted. So in addition, there are new laws as part of SB 1 for vote by mail to also provide your ID. We now require an envelope that on the flap of the envelope, you have to put your social or your driver's license. And we tell everyone to do both now because we know that the Secretary of State has some people with their driver's license number and some people with their social, but we don't know which and we don't know who. So we say put both just to be safe. If you lose your envelope, or most recently, thanks to the pandemic, as well as other environmental factors like a war in between Russia and Ukraine, there is an international paper shortage on top of weather, pandemic, et cetera, right? We now have an international paper shortage where ballots went out 2 weeks late for many of the counties in Texas. Again, decreasing the opportunity to be able to cast your vote. And then if that vote is not recorded, correct that error, okay? So it's all about timelines and reducing populations. 2 people here, 5 people there to get to 2%. That is how Republicans keep their stronghold in Texas. And this is purely political. To the point, and I'm gonna show you in just a second, there are people who are in jail for it. So this isn't just an issue where it's about our democracy, right? Like there's this like ethereal view of what democracy is and how we participate in our social contract. It's also a business transaction. Elections are also costing more. You have to have PPE. You have to have additional barriers to keep the election workers safe. We have a significant election worker turnover because if you have somebody with a gun, open carrying in a ballot location, and they're yelling at you because they get irate, you may not show up tomorrow because it's not worth the $10 an hour. There are more reporting requirements, database expenses because of SB1. And there's also the thing called permanent branch location. Previously, elections are cyclical even in the election itself. In Texas, you have your election day, and then you have 2 weeks of early voting prior to that. Really, again, back to deadlines. The last 2 days of early vote is where 50% of votes are cast in the early vote section. Then the other 50% are cast on election day. Good deadline. People love deadlines. Democrats love deadlines too. Democrats vote late. Republicans vote early. And they vote at the beginning of early vote. So counties could have, previous to SB1, they could have 50 early voting locations the last 2 days of early voting rather than 30, let's say. Now, because of this permanent branch requirement, you have to have an early voting location open the entirety of early vote, which means more time, more staff, and having to find more locations that will allow you to basically take over an entire portion of their building for an autonomous event that they cannot interrupt. There's also new requirements on the locations themselves and additional training required for all election staff. And then my favorite, most recent was we had some freezing rain. If it freezes, or if there's the threat of snow, the threat of snow, or the threat of a freeze, the entire state shuts down. I'm not talking about like the actual winter storm Uri. I'm talking about just like it's. You guys would laugh at it in Maine, but we closed down our polling locations in order to remedy that loss of time. Because if I'm a shift worker, I work 7 to 7. I'm waiting for the last day to vote. Well, this happened to be the last day to vote, or second to last day to vote, where we had to shut the election locations down early. I had to go fight with our county attorney and our county judge to increase the hours, so that way people who were, planning on voting before they go to work on their shift, and they work a 12-hour shift, like a lot of my nurses have 12-hour shifts at hospitals, for example, then we had to go put those hours somewhere else. And there was additional legal costs, additional staffing costs. But what does that result in? This is an opportunity for Maine to look into the future, because the same laws are being passed in Texas are happening in other states. We've already seen it in Missouri. We're seeing it in Alabama. I always like to joke that Mississippi keeps us from being the 50th in the US, but really we're the 50th when it comes to voter access. So the result of these attacks on elections is 23,000 mail ballots rejected. In order to even cast a mail ballot, you have to fill out a mail ballot application. I don't even have the numbers of the mail ballot applications rejected. It's not required to report it. So this is just a portion of the people whose ballots were rejected. I have Texans who I know who are in jail because they accidentally voted not knowing that they couldn't. My favorite is, and this is Crystal Mason, by the way. She faces a 5-year prison sentence for casting a provisional ballot that was never counted. She did not know that while on paper, while on probation, she could not cast a vote. We don't educate our voters, by the way. We don't educate our students on most things, let alone how to participate in their voting process. And so she went to go vote because the conditions of the jails that she was in were terrible. We have private prisons in Texas as well. So she wanted to cast a vote for somebody or in an election because of the way she was treated. And now she's facing 5 years. Another Tarrant County woman who was an immigrant, she was a dreamer, casted her vote, not knowing she couldn't cast her vote or that it was illegal. She received a 2-year sentence. Those are the two people from 2002 to 2014 who were prosecuted, a Black woman and a brown woman from Tarrant County. In addition, when we try to go and advocate for accessible elections in the state of Texas, you have to be physically present in the Texas Capitol to testify. Now, there was some pandemic changes where you could do testimony remotely, but in order to cast your support for or against a piece of legislation that in the people's house, in the people's state of Texas, with duly elected representatives to hear the people who they're there to represent, you have to be physically there in person. I have been in that Capitol past 2 a.m. more times than I can count. And not just because I have a 2-year-old that does not sleep. Election officials are now retiring. Our election official in Travis County retired 1 month before the primary in 2022. In 2022, the first election under SB1 was the joint primary for Democrats and Republicans to figure out who our nominees were going to be to go to the general. And 1 month prior to that election, the county clerk in Travis County resigned because she was being prosecuted and investigated by the attorney general. And it was a constant barrage of him threatening to investigate her to the point where she had to spend her own personal funds to have defense counsel, lawyers that she paid to defend her. And while there was never any proof of any voter fraud or any issues with her agency, the costs, the legal costs, and the constant stress, she was just tired of it. So these elections and the laws and the people and the motivations and the intimidation, they're all meant to disenfranchise voters to the point where even I at some point will question the integrity of our elections. And that's what we're fighting against in Texas. And that's what you can choose is the future for Maine.
I guess I will take it from there and just start off by saying, wow, that was so impactful. Thank you so much for that, Katie. I graduated from the University of Texas Public Policy School in 2019, and it's, even having been there, it's just really sobering how much worse it's gotten. And I really thank you for that. So I'm going to give some quick remarks now on how things are in Maine right now, what we can do to, as the title says, do not Texas Maine. And so just some really quick background around me. My name is Will Hayward. I'm the Advocacy Program Coordinator for League of Women Voters of Maine and Democracy Maine, Maine Citizens for Clean Elections. I've worked to advance pro-voter legislation over the last 2+ years, defend against bills that aim to suppress the vote, and I also conduct some of our election observation work. So I've had an opportunity to see how our elections are administered around the state. So I want to start off with the positive because I think it really is helpful to emphasize all the ways that Maine is not Texas presently. We do have very strong voting laws in Maine. We have some of the most pro-voter laws in the country. And there's a lot of them to be proud of, and I could go on and on, but the one I want to emphasize as I think the single most important backstop to help protect the right to vote in Maine is same-day voter registration. So this allows you, as many of you know, to go register to vote at the polling place. So if everything else falls through, you can still show up at the polling place and register to vote and cast your vote that day. And this is actually an area where Maine has stood up to attempts to suppress the vote before. In 2011, the legislature voted to repeal same-day registration. However, as folks probably know, Maine has a provision called the People's Veto, where you can collect signatures, and if you get enough signatures, the law doesn't go into effect, and then you vote on it at the ballot. And so that happened when same-day registration was repealed in 2011, and 60% of Maine voters voted to restore same-day registration. So Maine has a history of standing up to attempts to suppress the vote, and I think that's just going to be such an important thing moving forward. We have more great legislations passed in recent years. Automatic voter registration and online voter registration are both set to go into effect in the next couple of years. We have a much better redistricting process. I would still say not perfect, but it requires a 2/3 vote of the legislature to approve maps. So you don't end up with these partisan or racial gerrymanders that you see in many other states. We don't have a voter ID law, which is very important, and I'll mention a threat to that in a moment. We have a very robust challenge ballot process, which is actually much stronger than the typical provisional ballot laws in many states. So that's a very important backstop. And finally, we're passing some great legislation right now. We just learned that a bill to bring true post-election audits and more training infrastructure for the Secretary of State's office and clerks around the state, we just learned that's going to be in the proposed budget for this year. So that's a huge boost to our election infrastructure. And there's lots of other great legislation being passed right now too. So let me turn then to the challenges, because we have this really great infrastructure in Maine of strong laws, a history of participation in our elections, a history of standing up to attempts to suppress the vote. But that doesn't mean Maine is immune from what's happening nationally. It doesn't mean we're immune from what's happening in Texas. There are a few structural challenges that make Maine's elections vulnerable. Some of these include that it is fair to say we don't have the most modern elections. As I mentioned, we've passed online voter registration. We have not yet implemented it. So we still do have a quite paper-based system. And for ballots themselves, paper is great. It's great to have a paper ballot, to have a record. You don't want your entire election system to be founded on paper. So we still have some modernization to do to help our elections run as smoothly as possible. We also have a very decentralized election system. Katie, I'll take your 254 and raise you 500 municipalities in Maine, and that means that the same laws apply to Portland with 65,000 people, to Glenwood Plantation with 3 people. So you can have, as you can imagine, that can lead to differing election experiences. For instance, when the office is open to vote in advance of an election, do what's called in-person absentee, that the hours can vary widely by municipality. So these are some structural challenges, but more importantly, some of this national stolen election discourse has started to appear here, and this is really worrying. When I monitor the legislature and I hear, the remarks that legislators give around voting, I have heard some false claims, about college students being bussed in from out of state. I've heard some pretty strong implications that clerks are not always acting ethically, that they're not always, properly counting the votes. I would say that they're mostly, kept to sort of stray remarks you hear for now, but I'm hearing a lot more of them now than I was 2 years ago. So it's a really concerning trend. We've seen these false affidavits being circulated around the state calling for a review of the 2020 election here. I know people have seen these at county fairs and other places. To be clear, they have no legal grounding. There's no mechanism to reopen that election, nor should there be. We know it was free and fair. There's a citizens initiative petition being circulated to institute a strict voter ID process in Maine. So one action you can take is if you're approached by anyone seeking your signature, and they may not be totally honest about the purpose of it, but if they approach you about these to sign the question to put a voter ID question on the ballot, you can always decline to sign, and I would very, very strongly encourage you to. And this has had a real effect on our elections here. We have heard that in the past year, more of our election officials are retiring than have in previous years. We've heard in the legislature, we've heard clerks come and testify about the threats that they're seeing, the added hostility that they're getting in interactions with people in the public who don't trust them, who question their motives. So it's something that's growing, and the loss of that, that expertise, that experience of our election officials is a really serious thing that I do worry about. And finally, we've seen misinformation grow. We've seen, so many falsities about elections, both in Maine and elsewhere. And we've seen them increase, and we expect them, unfortunately, to increase more in the run-up to the 2022 elections. So these are some of the trends we see here. We thankfully have only seen a few bills proposed that would suppress the vote, and we have seen them soundly defeated. But that is not to say that this is the last, as I'm sure you all can imagine. So let me turn to the next slide then, just to discuss what we can do, because this is what I think you can take away with you to know how to address this in Maine. The first thing I would say is to support our election officials. Election officials in Maine, more than a lot of places, I think really are part of the community. They're your neighbors, they're your friends, they're people you see all the time. And they really need to have that community support. Coming up on April 12th will be Thank Election Heroes Day, and I expect that we'll be announcing sometime next week what we're going to be doing around that, but it's just really important to have that solidarity with our election officials. The next thing I would encourage you to do is to thoughtfully combat misinformation. And the league put on a training on this recently that I would really encourage people to check out, but the best way to combat misinformation is to be very mindful about not amplifying the lie itself. To be, sharing how elections are run, how they are fair and free and accessible, but to not be sort of, re-amplifying what the lie is, because then more and more people see it. And finally, volunteer to be a poll worker. Being a poll worker is the best way to be directly involved in the election process. And many of our municipalities always need poll workers. So it's a great way to have a firsthand way to say, our elections are free and fair, and I'm helping that happen. And so then finally, longer term, I think I would just say, be ready. If we see more legislation that threatens the right to vote, if we see things qualify for the ballot by a citizens initiative, be ready to mobilize, take action, public testimony, public outreach, and then of course, as I mentioned in 2011, the people of Maine fought back against the attempt to repeal same-day voter registration. We need to be ready if we need to do something like that again. So just in summary on Maine, we're in a very strong position, I would say, relative to many states, but some of the poisonous national efforts to undermine our elections and suppress voters, they really are starting to appear here. We should take that seriously. So we all need to take that very seriously and be positioned to help push back should it grow. And so I will leave it there so get to a few questions and wrap. Thank you so much. And thank you again, Katie. That was a wonderful presentation.
Wow. Yes. Katie, thank you for that terrifying and sobering account of what you're facing on a daily basis. And Will, thanks for the reality check. You know, both the ways that we can say, oh, phew, we're not Texas yet, and we're not Texas yet. We need to hold both of those things. Be proud of what we've got here in terms of voting access and voting rights, and also really on guard. I know if for many of you are probably feeling a little shell shocked right now of like, wow, that's a lot to process, and how can I help? I want to let you know we can be part of helping protect democracy in Texas as well as in Maine. In the follow-up email that you get this afternoon, you will find not just a recording to this program, which I say share with everybody you can think of, and then a few more, but you'll also see an action to click through and tell our senators to confirm Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court matters. It matters in the protection of our democracy and in everything that we care about. People often or occasionally say to MCV, aren't you guys an environmental organization? What are you doing talking about elections? It's like, well, it's all connected. It's all connected. So you probably have heard that Senator Collins is expected to have a very important vote in the Supreme Court confirmation. So please take a moment to let her know that we are lucky to have a nominee like Ketanji Brown Jackson. And if you haven't been watching the hearings this week, I really encourage you to take a moment to do that. You'll also find information about an upcoming event at the University of Southern Maine in the Women and Gender Studies program about violence against women in politics. It is coming up on April 8th. It conflicts with our Lunch and Learn, but it's hosted by some of our very favorite friends, including the League of Women Voters of Maine. And so we will forgive you if you decide to tune into that one and catch the recording of our program. We could go all day with questions because, Katie, I just want to know about the local reaction and what kind of support you're getting or not getting. And thank you for your work. And I want to know about what the future looks like for you and when I can help support your campaign for whatever it is you're going to run for. But we only have a couple of minutes, so I'll ask you both this one question. Who are the funders, visible or dark, who are supporting voter suppression, both in Texas and in Maine? It's an easy one.
Sadly, because of Citizens United and some of the decisions, in Texas, again, our campaign finance laws are also interesting. A joke that's the Wild West, but you can give $1 million check to a state official. And in fact, after Winter Storm Uri, one of the natural gas companies did give the governor $1 million check, because after that special session or after that legislative session, the natural gas companies that help supply the energy to fund or to run the Texas grid, they did not, while they were a part of the reason why electricity went out for 80% of the state, they did not face any additional regulatory changes or required weatherizing. And then the governor received $1 million. And while the governor says, I didn't get that $1 million because it was a quid pro quo, it was just interesting that other industries faced quite a bit of regulatory movement, but not that industry. And in fact, 5 days before Winter Storm Uri started to hit the state of Texas, natural gas companies shut down. My staff of nurses were in the field 6 hours before Winter Storm Uri hit to see our patients. And so that's just kind of the difference. And so you can give large amounts of money in Texas to our state officials. There are federal limits to our federal officials, and there are different limits for municipal and local officials. But for most county and state officials, there aren't. There are also PACs as well as nonprofit corporations that house a lot of those funds. And so in Texas, there's a group, I'm blanking on, it's a Texas Public Policy Foundation, TPPF, which is a far-right conservative think tank. A lot of Trump folks that left the Trump administration came into that think tank here in Texas. They're funding a lot of it. And then we're seeing candidates themselves, elected officials, the lieutenant governor in particular, has a number of political action committees around this. And in fact, in the 2022 primary, the lieutenant governor himself sent out vote by mail applications. So government entities cannot send out vote by mail applications. Campaigns and parties can. And but because the lieutenant governor does not trust our county officials to, in certain counties, by the way, he didn't do this on every application he sent out, he only did it on certain ones. If it was an urban county that had a Democratic elected official, the application that he sent out said, send your application to the Secretary of State. As a result, all of those applications got rejected. So he's actually funding it from his campaign, voter misinformation and voter disenfranchisement. And I think it's important, you know, when folks send direct messages, that you guys know that I get those. I know you think what I'm saying is hyperbole. In fact, you've said that it's hyperbole, and we're not facing this in Maine. In 2013, I was in the Texas Capitol when we were looking at voter ID laws, and it started with that law. So while, yes, we've had an additional decade, we're a decade ahead of you in voter suppression, do not be confused, my friend. It starts with little chips here and there. This is not hyperbole. I know people in jail for trying to vote. My life has been threatened, so has my child's. So don't tell me it's hyperbole, because you're not living my life and you're not facing my experience in Texas. But I'm still fighting, and I hope you fight too, because there's a lot of hope in Maine. And the challenges you have to face, I hope you learn from the challenges we have failed at in Texas. That's what I'm here to do, is to give you, with love and kindness and respect, my experience in the state of Texas and the experience of thousands of Texans, unfortunately. Not hyperbole. Check your laws and come and volunteer with Will and with Kathleen and with the other Wills, so you don't become hyperbole.
Well, I will keep my answer to this very short, which is just to say that, you know, I think, as you probably deduced from what I'm sharing, these efforts aren't particularly organized yet, so we have not seen a lot of money going into specific campaigns yet. However, if we were to, and I get to wear my Maine Citizens for Clean Elections hat here, it would be very hard to, you know, follow all of that money. Citizens United has been blown a huge hole in the ability to really, you know, identify funders of these sorts of efforts. So I think we know this from all the ballot question campaigns we've seen recently, the corridor question, of course, being one, and then the Senate race in 2020. There is a lot of money in politics, and it will be used to say a lot of things that are at best distortions of the truth. So we should be ready for that and ready to call that out if we do see it.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Katie. Thank you for sharing. You're so clear and compelling about the challenges, but I also know that's got to be, you know, that's a lot to carry. And so thank you. And I hope your friends in Maine can help you carry it a little bit, and that we will stand right with you in protecting our democracy. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. You will get a follow-up email later this afternoon, and I hope you'll join us next week. We'll be talking about Maine's Pine Tree Amendment and the national movement for constitutionally protected environmental rights. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend, and thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, all.